Okay, good evening. Oh, we got to do better than that. It's all right, it's evening time, but we still got a little energy in the tank, so feel free to let it go. My name is Charlton McIlwain. I am Vice Provost and Professor of Media, Culture, and Communication here at NYU. And on behalf of the John Brademas Center for the Study of Congress, I would like to welcome you to today's Town Hall Election 2024 in Perspective, part of NYU's In Dialogue series. So we extend a warm welcome to all of you who are joining us here tonight in the room at the NYU School of Law, as well as those joining us virtually or on Zoom. Today we are joined by a bipartisan and distinguished group of campaign strategists. You are, I promise. Journalists, scholars of public policy that cover national politics. Together, they will help us make sense of the current state of U.S. politics, the issues motivating the electorate, and preview the election that is now only 1 week away. Students, do we have any in the room? All right, excellent.
Yay.
Yes. You will be invited to pose questions to the panel to address the concerns that you have. And this program tonight is co-sponsored by our friends here at the Brennan Center here at NYU. The conversation is very much aligned with a core mission of NYU's John Brademas Center, inspired by Indiana Congressman and NYU President John Brademas, to provide a forum for informed and civil conversation on politics, public policy, and other core issues facing our nation. Each of our panelists has had long and distinctive careers, but in the interest of time, I will only provide some brief introductions. You probably know most of them, I would imagine. Michael Steele is a former Lieutenant Governor of Maryland, former chairman of the Republican National Committee, where he is the first African American to hold both positions. He has had a very interesting educational background. After graduating from Johns Hopkins University, he studied for the priesthood for several years in Philadelphia before enrolling and receiving his JD at Georgetown University in DC. Michael is a faculty fellow at Brown University's Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs and regularly participates in panels organized by the NYU Brademas Center. S.E. Cupp is a leading CNN conservative political commentator, most recently serving as the host of CNN's S.E. Cupp Unfiltered, which covered the intersection of politics and media. She continues to be a nationally syndicated political columnist, culture critic, and author, writing regularly for the New York Daily News, Glamour, and CNN.com. She is a graduate of Cornell University, where she is an advisory member of the Institute of Politics and Global Affairs. And last and most importantly, she earned her master's degree from NYU's Gallatin School of Individualized Study. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Karen Finney.
My son went to NYU. If that.
It's not the same.
Hey.
It's not the same thing.
It's not the same thing. Okay.
Here we go. Karen Finney is a respected television host and commentator, leading political and communication strategy that works at the intersections of politics, media, and culture change. Her unique career includes roles as top Democratic communication strategist, political commentator for CNN and MSNBC, television and radio show host, and White House staffer. She serves on the boards of Let America Vote, End, Citizens United, and is also a co-convener of the Black Women's Leadership Collective. All of you saw probably on our program that Scott Jennings was supposed to be with us today, but unfortunately could not join us this evening. When it comes to time for Q&A, we'll have some microphones, folks with microphones going around to get your questions. But for now, we got a little bit of time and a lot to cover. So we are going to jump right in. let's start where we started to get to back in the room there. Election.
Yeah, we did a whole show in the green
did
room
a whole
before.
show.
Yeah.
Before
I
we
don't know
came
if we can
out.
recreate it, but we're going to try.
Should have been filming that.
Had the cameras rolling. Everybody, 24/7, all in on the election. Over the weekend, reports about how many Americans were going through some form of election anxiety. Part of that fueled, at least I'll speak for myself, incessantly watching the polls, trying to gain some insight into that question, which is, I'm sure, is my candidate going to win? And so we know in 2016, 2020, professional pollsters were widely criticized for their inaccuracies and things that did not come to pass. So here's the question for all of us to open this up. What are you seeing in the polls right now about the upcoming election? Are they telling us anything useful? What is it that you are pulling from or drawing from in terms of polling or other information that's given you some real insight as to what might actually happen a week from now?
Well, let me start by saying, so Linda Lake, who's a Democratic pollster, she's excellent. She was on Inside Politics yesterday and said, "Get off the polar coaster."
Yes, please, get off.
That's good.
And I was like, okay, if the pollster says get off the polar coaster, it's time to get off the polar coaster. And by that, I mean, at this point, the polls aren't telling us much because you have to consider who are they talking to? Are they talking and how are they reaching them? How are they weighting those polls? Because most of these polls are focused on likely voters. Like, what does that mean, right? So I've been looking more closely at polls that have been done by groups that are looking at actual voters, where it's like one of the things I've been very concerned about is, for example, the New York Times. They'll do a poll sample size of 2,000. That's good. But then it's about 400 African Americans, and they say, okay, Donald Trump is winning African Americans by 20%. And it's like, that's just not possible. That's not happening, right? But if you look at polls being done by organizations like Black PAC or the NAACP, where it's a 2,000 sample size of Black people, I think you get a much better picture of what's really going on. So I like to go, like AARP does older women, Voto Latino. I like to go to the groups, the polls that are, because they're also written in ways that are culturally competent and relevant to the people like Gen Z. There are groups that are polling their cohort, and I think those are better and more effective. The thing to look at to me now is voter registration. What does turnout look like? And, people are looking at things like, where is the turnout coming from? But part of the challenge, and these guys can speak to this better than I don't think we know. So I don't think we can compare what's happening this time to 2020, obviously, because it was COVID. Not really to 2022, because it's a presidential. So trying to look at patterns of behavior to say, oh, these Republican counties are turning out in higher numbers than the Democratic counties, because some of these folks are going to vote in person who may have voted by mail the last time. And we don't know how many Republicans might actually be voting for Kamala Harris or doing a write-in. So I think there's just so much that we can't measure that I think it's hard to get an accurate sense of who's up and who's down.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. I think anything that's calling itself a national poll, just take it and leave it for the dog to play with, because it's meaningless. The polling in this country has not been the same since about 2012, 2014. And it's because, guess what? People are moving, people are changing, attitudes are changing. So what was typical of a group during the Reagan era and during the Bush era, and even during at least the first term of the Obama era, it's no longer relevant because attitudes are changing. I'll give you a quick example of that. The fact that you have folks talking about Black people, especially men, supporting Donald Trump. There is a truth to that at a certain level, but to Karen's point, it's not 20%. But it does speak to the changes that are happening within each community that makes up this wonderful, diverse, crazy electorate that engages at a roughly 55 to 57% level, which means there are a whole lot of folks that aren't engaged. And what happens and what does that do to your polling when you call up someone who hasn't voted in 4 cycles and ask them how they're voting? That's going to skew your results quite a bit. That's one. 2, right now, there has been for the last month a concerted slow roll effort by Republicans to salt the national numbers.
I'm so glad you said that.
So what that means is we're going to do a poll very much along the lines that you were just describing, in which we're going to weight it slightly differently. And the way you weight a poll, meaning the demographic groups that you reach out to, white women versus black women, white men versus black men, et cetera, will skew your result. The idea being that we will put these numbers out. You may have seen some numbers showing, especially if you're on Twitter, don't get me started, in which you see Trump 51, Kamala 47. Trump 52, Kamala 43. Let me just be clear. There is at no time, at anywhere on this planet or Earth 2, that Donald Trump had 50% plus of anything. During his 4 years as president, his highest number was 48%. That's his ceiling. The effort has been for some time to take Kamala Harris's floor, which we know is about 48, 49%, and drag it below his ceiling, which is 47, 48, which, to their credit, has been a very effective effort that now has this race tied, what? 48, 48. And part of that narrative comes out of this effort to salt the national polls, to get you believing that A, Donald Trump has a lot more momentum than he does, B, Kamala Harris has lost a lot of that momentum that she had coming out of the announcement, the convention, and the rollout from all of that. The problem goes to the last thing, and I'll shut up and let you. But I do this stuff as a county chairman, state chair. I've done, so I can just tell them what I'm telling you. Trust me, this is the plan. The problem is what the polling does not take into account. And I'll just give you 2 big events, just 2. When Joe Biden made the switch, right, and got out, Kamala's in, what happened? Roughly that weekend, 400,000 young people, many of your age in this room, did what? Registered to vote. And who do you think they're voting for? Okay. Taylor Swift, the night of the convention, the night of Kamala's speech at the convention, did what? Endorsed Kamala Harris. What happened? Over 300,000 young people from across the country, a lot of them in battleground states, did what? Registered. Here's the thing to keep in mind. In those 2 big events, almost 800,000 new voters were introduced into the political system. There's not a pollster on this planet who knows who they are. And they're not accounted for in anything. Why is that important? You put a pin in that because in 2016, what was everybody saying after that election? Where the hell did all these voters come from? How did Donald Trump get these? I didn't see that Hillary Clinton was supposed to win. What happened was they mined through a very careful voter outreach effort, voters who hadn't participated in the system in over 30 years. And everybody knows a cousin, an uncle, or some lazy-ass person who hasn't voted in a long time. But in 2016, they did. That was the Donald Trump voter that drew his numbers up and drew them out. So what's happening now is a lot of a reverse of that, where a lot of voters are coming into the system, particularly between 18 and 25, who are not accounted for by the system. And they're going to participate. They're active, they're excited, and they're engaged. And it will change the way the election plays out on Tuesday.
Everything that Karen and LG just said is correct, and I'll just add a layer. The voters that they're talking about, these are ghost voters, and that's sort of a newish, it's not a new phenomenon, but we're really starting to acknowledge that they're part of this phenomenon for the first time, and we're trying to get a handle on who they are. And to LG's point, sorry, I call him LG because we're old friends, and Lieutenant Governor is what
LG.
that's what I call him for 15 years. Sorry, Michael Steele. Nobody knows how they're going to vote. We have an idea, maybe, right? But we don't know how they're going to vote. And that's the case in a lot of the battleground states. For example, I just talked to a reporter in Arizona today about the early voting numbers. And I said, well, who's it looking good for? And she said, well, the Republicans are voting in bigger numbers than the Democrats so far. But just because they're registered Republican does not mean you know how they voted, because they can't, they're not looking at ballots. They're just looking at who the registered votes coming in, right? So, especially in Arizona, a very independent, weird, state. I say that as someone who used to live there. A registered Democrat, you don't know who they're voting for. A registered Republican, you don't know who they're voting for. An independent, and the independents outweigh both parties in Arizona. So these are ghost voters. You don't always know to the polls. But let me give you all some permission through a different lens. So this election I'm covering differently than I have in all the past cycles. I'm covering it through the lens of the 7 swing states. Okay, that's all I'm looking at. The 7 swing states, I'm talking to voters in those states, and I'm talking to reporters on the ground in those states. If you are not in one of those 7 swing states, and inside those 7 swing states, if you are not independent, undecided, or moderate, you don't matter. I'm sorry. You don't matter. And that doesn't mean don't vote. Of course that means, of course vote. But if you're just looking at who is going to decide this election, it's not base voters. If you're a voter who has always voted Republican the past 3 cycles, you don't count. If you're a voter who's always voted Democrat the past 8 cycles, you're counted for. You are already in that tally. The people that are going to turn this from 48-48, a statistical or in fact actual tie in all 7 of the swing states, are the undecided, moderate, and independent voters who aren't telling us who they're voting for yet. We have a week to go, and those are still the people that are going to decide this election. It was tight in 2020. Y'all remember in Georgia, it came down to like 11,000 plus voters, right? Trump wanted to find just one more, right? It's going to be even tighter, I think, this time in these 7 swing states. This election could be decided by 1,000 votes in Maricopa County or 100 votes in Erie, PA. That is how granular it is. And listen, both campaigns are smart. They know this. They know that every voter is going to matter. So when the UAW doesn't endorse a candidate, both campaigns know, okay, I got to get these voters. I cannot afford to give up auto workers in Michigan. Or I can't afford to give up young people who are uncommitted in Michigan. Or I can't afford the coalitions that you could maybe write off because they were only 50,000 or 100,000 voters. You can't do that now. So it's going to be super tight. But if the polls are driving you crazy, if the news is driving you crazy, if the ads are driving you crazy, I am giving you permission to do other stuff. Go live your life, okay? Because this election in some ways is already baked. That doesn't mean we know who's gonna win. And when you hear people like our Harry Enton on CNN saying, someone could sweep it, that doesn't mean it's gonna be a landslide. All that means is the conditions in all 7 of these battleground states are similar. And so if these voters turn out in Pennsylvania, the thinking is there will be a similar kind of thing in Nevada and Georgia and Wisconsin. It doesn't mean anyone's running away with it. It's still going to be tight, but you don't have to drive yourself crazy. And the anxiety is real. I get it. I'm responsible for a lot of it. I feel badly about that. Okay? But you don't. You don't have to internalize it. And I'm not saying this election isn't important. It is so important. The stakes are so high. But the math is real narrow and specific, and y'all are probably not involved. Sorry.
Maybe let me take off from there, since you've mentioned it a couple times about the business you all represent and the work that you all do as being part of the media, part of where voters get their information. I feel like every election there's a referendum on the media focused on the horse race, doesn't cover issues, there are all kinds of criticisms. Yeah. What's happening this year that's different, that might be better? Are there things that have changed? What's been the structure of reporting, commentary, et cetera? And has it, in your view, fueled a lot of this anxiety in unnecessary ways, or the kind of misinformation that, Michael, you talked a little bit about in terms of polling and so forth? What's the state of things?
I am very pissed off because I have found the media to be wholly irresponsible and at the same time responsible for where we are, because it has not been an honest broker in this narrative that began in 2015, when a lot of folks in the press who had a pre-existing relationship with the developer from Queens, New York, took that pre-existing relationship and used it as the basis for what would become later on $3 billion worth of free advertising to one candidate running for the presidency of the United States in 2016 that was not shared by or received by any other candidate in that race, because they had a particular relationship that, for whatever reason, in whatever way, they were amused by. And it has been very frustrating for me to watch all these years later, some try to figure out how to unpack that and now try to course correct. Others just basically saying WTF and proceeding as usual. And then others, like the Washington Post, of which I am more than familiar, having grown up in Washington, D.C., and remember the coverage very well from back in the day with Watergate and my own campaigns, and how the Post was very clear it wanted to endorse my opponent a number of times, to now suddenly at this hour say, you know what, I think we're just going to take a pass. Because we did that like 34, 40 years ago, we don't need to do it again. It is so disingenuous and so much a part of the problem, because the owner of the Post has a little thing called Blue Origin, which is in direct competition with Elon Musk's enterprise, both of which are government contractors. You have Elon Musk, who has a dogged, polluted platform that was once a good place for free press and dialogue, using it basically as a bullhorn for a political candidate as he's receiving the benefit of shooting stuff into space with the support of the federal government. And that, to me, speaks to a lot of the things that piss off a lot of people in this room and foments the distrust in not just that system, but all systems, because they're interconnected. It's how you cover, how you tell the story, how you expose stuff, what you report, what you don't report. So I have found myself a number of times, since I am on a broadcast network and have my own show on this network, I have someone in my ear go, okay, now they're about to bring up polls. You can't say, because it's an NBC poll, you can't call it crap, okay? And so it for me, it's very, very frustrating to watch, because of all the institutions, this one, the press, in all of its organs, was the one that we rely on the most to help bring the clarity and to help us see where the crap is before we step in it. But when they're the ones putting the crap in our path, this is where we are. That's just my take.
Can I just make a distinction? And I share your frustration. You know I do. And I'll just tell an anecdote and then some analysis. But my second life is at Bravo. Okay, when I'm not doing politics, it's where like I go to escape, right? Real Housewives, injected into my veins. And I love it so much, and I've loved it so much for a very long time that I do Bravo. I go and watch What Happens Live, and I'll go out to BravoCon where I'll interview Bravo celebrities, okay? Do not call this a guilty pleasure. I am not guilty. I feel no guilt. I love it. Anyway, I was out at BravoCon maybe last year, and I'm walking around this giant, the Javits Center, right? This giant exposition center. Hundreds of thousands of people are there. And they're all on the floor, and they're lining up to meet their favorite housewife or whatever. And I'm walking around, and I'm like, man, these people are so happy. They're so happy to be here. And I said, I'm so envious because in my job at my network, I make people angry and afraid. And I do feel badly about that. I don't like that. I don't enjoy that. It's not why I became a journalist. It's not why I got into politics. That's the part, LG's right about the other stuff, but that's the part that really bothers me. The way we play into and stoke your fears. Donald Trump does that too. A leader should not. A leader should tamp down your fears and say, let me tell you how to calm down with this and not prey on your fears and your anger. And I feel like we do that too much. Now, when I say we, the distinction I want to make here as a member of the press, there's national news, right? And that's the cables that we live on. There's also local news. And I don't want to lump in local news with national news. Because what happens at local news, I think, is much more important than anything we are saying on the cable nets. Your daily life is not impacted by what I say on CNN or LG says on MSNBC. Your life is impacted by the local reporter covering your sanitation board in your town, or your school board in your town, or letting you know that the water you're drinking in Flint, Michigan is bad, right? Or name your local news issue. This stuff still really matters to you. And in fact, we've done studies showing that when a local television station or a local newspaper shutters, corruption in that town goes up. Sometimes those towns get bankrupted because of graft and avarice and dysfunction. The people holding your local representatives accountable are still doing a really, really important job. And local news can very quickly become national news. Look at Penn State, right? Sandusky. Look at Spotlight in Boston, right? The Syrian civil war started out as a protest in a small town. That became international news based on the coverage of local journalists on the ground. So while we get a bad rap and a lot of it's deserved, I don't want to paint all of the press and all of journalism as bad or ruining politics or, whatever it is. Local news is still really important, and I think all the more reason we need to invest in it. And I would say pay more attention, less attention to us, more attention to the people covering your community. And if that's your school, that's important, especially with these geopolitical issues going on. But if it's your town, your hometown, your town back home, this is where your life is most impacted.
So I look at it a little differently. As someone who's a practitioner, as a communications professional, and as someone who I consider myself an opinion journalist. So it's my job to give you my most educated opinion based on what I'm seeing, what I'm hearing, and my experience. And to what Essie said, we try not to scare people.
Yeah.
I try to say when I think a topic is really stupid, but okay, sure, let's talk about it, right? Because sometimes I think the media gets focused on the wrong things. Right now, for example, look, I think it's important what Trump said last night, what happened last night. Yeah. But I think the media is making the same mistake. I was in Hillary Clinton's 2016 campaign, and one of the things that was so infuriating was there was so much coverage of him, to what you said, in the primaries and in the general election, and of course Hillary's emails, because we all know that impacted our lives tremendously, but also the fact that everything he said would drive a whole cycle. And right now, like, we're losing the plot. The plot is, what does it mean to say, I'm going to do mass deportations? What does that mean for our economy? What is it? How? And when you say, well, how's that going to work? Is it the police? Is it the army? Is it the National Guard? You're going to go house to house. We're going to have to show you our ID, right? Like, so instead of talking about the latest crazy thing he said, we should be talking about, we're having a very asymmetrical conversation with this whole, well, I don't know her policy. Really? Because she's giving you a lot more detail on a lot of things than he has. And what I hear from my media colleagues is, oh, well, but that's baked in. Well, that doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about it. Right. Just because we think we know how people feel about him doesn't mean, and I think that's part of the mistake that media is making consistently. They're going with what they think is going to get eyeballs and ad dollars, not necessarily what is actually going to most affect your life. And but the other thing I want to say, that I think this election is revolutionary, and a project that I'm working on, we're now in an environment where every one of you is a journalist, essentially, right? Because of our devices, we are all content creators. We all can have our opinions, we can all share information. And I think we're about to have a revolution in terms of, where we get our information. You can get your information where you want it, when you want it, on the channel you want it, from the person you want. You don't have to watch our cable networks. It's part of why cable is dying.
And you're not.
Right. You're not, right?
Yeah. Right.
And so I think that's the other. And I actually think part of that is because we're not talking enough about what people really want to know about. And I don't know how it's all going to shake out, but I want us to be thinking, I'm sort of thinking a lot, I'm working with content creators, micro-influencers in battleground states, because the 3,000, 5,000, 10,000 people who follow them, they're going to convince people to vote. Yeah. What I say on CNN is going to get you to vote. It's far more important the people who are looking for information, looking for these sources, these non-traditional sources. So I think that's a big piece of this fractured media landscape that we live in, where it is about what's happening online, what's happening on streaming, what's happening on broadcast television, cable television, print, you name it. And we have more sources than ever of information. The most important thing is you all have to be discerning consumers of that information and try to figure out what's bull and what's true and what rings true for you. And I think that's a big difference.
If I could just real quick to connect both those dots. Folks, there's a reason why certain countries on this planet do not allow their citizens to have full access to the internet, to the very things that we're talking about, because the last point that Karen made is really critically important in terms of what tomorrow looks like, where you have more and more everyday folks out there, whether they are in a village in China or, an apartment on Fifth Avenue, writing content and telling stories and sharing what's happening in their world personally. Here's a picture of my dog versus other storylines that talk about abuse and violence and what governments are doing, et cetera. And the real interesting point will be, and this is part and parcel of what we see playing out in this election, at what point does the government go, okay, that's enough. We've heard enough, no more. And we have to guard against that if we want to continue to tell those stories about our dog or about the abuse of power.
Well, or even just, I mean, one of the content creators I work with, she went to a football game with her dad. She's African American. She's like, I'm going to talk to my dad and his buddies at the football game about who they're voting for and why. And like she did a short video and it was great. And it was very interesting to hear these men in their own words talk about who and why versus here's the latest poll from blah, blah, blah network, right? Let's listen to actual people.
Right.
This rise of anecdata, which is, I think, a really great contextual way to tell the story of this election. And just one example to end cap this conversation on the press. I'm talking to voters in swing states. When you ask them about migrants eating pets in Ohio, this does not matter to them. It has dominated the news for however many weeks or months. They don't care. It's not like they're, they might have an opinion about it. It is not impacting their vote at all. You don't know that from a poll. You know that by going to Eau Claire, Wisconsin, or wherever and asking voters on the ground, does this story bother you? Does this story impact you? This kind of anecdata is probably not predictive the way you'd want it to be, but it does give you the contours of the climate around certain kinds of voters in the places that are going to decide this election. And the more we do that, the kinds of things Karen's talking about, I think the fuller picture we're going to have versus the talking heads on the cables.
One more question before we turn it out to our audience and some questions here. Paint us a picture of November 6th and after. What's the work? What's the work that has to be done? We've got a lot of scenarios with who wins, Senate so close, the House so close. No matter who wins in your estimation, take it from however you want to, what has to start to happen after? We were talking a little bit about, is this a wake-up moment for the Republican Party and a realignment if Trump loses? What do we do to get back to, hey, we can't focus on the dog whistles constantly and we got to do the work about these important issues? What's happening?
One of the things that I will say concerns me, and I've had this conversation with reporters over the last 4 years, if Kamala wins, is I don't think the media has the nomenclature to cover the first Black South Asian female president. Because I can't tell you how many times I've had calls from reporters who say, I know this is a really dumb story. It's a female reporter. Her editor is a man who says, but my editors think that, want me to write about this. So I will say that's one of the things that I'm concerned about. And to the conversation we were just having, I don't think the media has figured out, even now, how to cover Trump. They've been trying to figure out the balance. I don't think they figured it out. If he's reelected, I'm not sure what happens. I'm not sure how they handle it. But I think big picture in terms of our politics, I think we have to decide, and part of the problem is exactly what we said, only about 50% of the country actually engages. And the thing is that, civic engagement is a verb. It's not a noun. It's not something you do once. And if we're actually going to try to change the Republican Party or, change the country, we have to figure out how, and this again goes back to why one of the reasons I'm interested in working with these content creators and micro-influencers is how do we get people more involved and invested in civic engagement? Because as I worked at the DNC, actually when Michael was at the RNC, and his comms director used to call me and say, how do you deal with crazy Howard Dean? I need some help dealing with crazy Michael Steele.
And the reason was I adopted a lot of Howard Dean's strategy. I love the idea of a 50-state strategy because the party had never done it. I was like, we're going in all 50 states. And he looked at me like, why? I said, because that's where the voters are. And 63 seats later, they were very happy we did. She wasn't. But
I think we have to, and we'll see with the House and the Senate and with state government sort of what's happening. But I think, a lot of it is it's going to be a pivotal moment, right? To decide, maybe we'll still be in this resistance posture that we were, from 2017 to 2020, Or maybe we'll have an opportunity to imagine what something different looks like. But look, the reality of politics is, I mean, this is like Larry Hogan, who's running for Senate in Maryland. He was a popular Republican governor, nice, moderate guy.
Twice elected.
Twice elected. My mom, even, she lives in Maryland. She's a hippie. She liked him. But and he's talking about how he's going to be able to be independent. He's not going to be independent. If Republicans control the Senate, he's going to be 100 of 100, and he will get told what to do. And if he doesn't do it, he's going to find out who's boss. And so that we have to be thinking about, well, what does that mean for what's possible? And similarly with the House, I mean, my hope is what's possible is maybe we do more things like the infrastructure, bipartisan infrastructure, and maybe we actually get some things done, but it will only happen if voters and Americans rise up and say, it's not acceptable, right? It's not enough for us to just complain, but they have to hear from us that it's not acceptable. There have to be consequences for that behavior, or it doesn't change, I don't think.
Well, yes, all of that. I worry, to your point, maybe, LG, you want to talk about some of the machinations after the election that will happen, that both parties will have to deal with on the legal fronts or whatever. But to your point of, I'll address what happens to the Republican Party, because this has been a focus of mine since 2012. I was asked to work on the 2012 autopsy to address some deficiencies inside the Republican Party, namely, how do we message better to women, millennials, LGBTQ, and minorities? Okay, I got to work on that. And we had really identified some great policy messages around the tax code, which was punitive to some of these people, around regulations, entrepreneurialism. I thought, came up with some great inroads to reach these new groups that we had been not reaching. And you know who came along and didn't care about any of that, so the RNC didn't care anymore about any of that. Michael wasn't there. Nope. This was not Michael. Okay? And slowly or quickly, depending on your point of view, Donald Trump remade the party. And the Republican Party let that happen to itself. Okay? He's not some magician that waved a wand. They incrementally, step by step, you could go forensically like a detective and pinpoint the times during which the Republican Party said, okay, we're gonna shelve this. We're no longer anti-protectionist, right? We're okay with tariffs now. We don't really care that much about the debt and the deficit anymore because Trump didn't care. All of these micro shifts added to what we have now, which is a party I don't recognize. It doesn't feel conservative at all. Conservatism isn't on the ballot at all. I don't see it evidenced in the House for the most part. It still exists a bit in the Senate, but those people are mostly leaving. And what Trump did in addition to that is actually asked good conservatives to leave the party. So it's condensing. You know those old cans of orange juice, right? Condensed orange juice. You're meant to add water to them. The Republicans are not adding water to this orange juice. Correct. That is right. And so what's the future of the party? It's not just, getting rid of Trump. You have to decide conservatism matters again. All the stuff that they jettisoned for a guy who didn't care about any of it. And I don't think there's a lot of elected Republicans who are interested in that. And once you get Trump to go, let's say he loses and decides miraculously he doesn't want to grift off the American people and run again. You still have to deal with Trumpism, which is very healthy. I don't mean that positively. It is alive and well inside the Republican Party. It has replaced conservatism. So what do you do about that? You have to be a party that's willing to lose elections if you want to reorient around conservatism again. That's a big ask. That would be a big ask of Democrats. Are you willing to lose elections to change your compass and be something different? That doesn't happen a lot, but you did. Well, we did it too in past years. There's no interest right now. And I think this is why you're seeing something like 66% of the American electorate are displeased with the two-party system. It's asymmetrical, but there's an extremism over here and an extremism over here that is not representing most people in the middle who don't want to take these purity tests to belong to one party or the other. And so it's leaving a lot of people out. I'm maybe less concerned about what becomes of the Republican Party, because I think it's done, than I am what becomes of our electoral politics, our party system, the way we choose candidates. If we're just going out in the primaries, we're going to have a lot more of this kind of politics instead of moderate people running the country who actually want to govern and get things done.
Can I say one thing before you go, really quick? Because you should talk about this, but
Go.
I want us also to be thinking about the fact that it's not just the 6th, it's from November 6th to January 6th.
Yeah.
And then the future,
Yeah, right.
that we got to be
right.
thinking about.
Well, now that's where I'm going to go.
That's what I figured, so I wanted to
So-
tee it up for you.
In inaugural week,
Oh, boy, so bad.
2017, on a stage in a hall in Washington, D.C., sat Reince Priebus, chairman of the Republican National Committee, my former general counsel, and Steve Bannon. And they were asked a question: what is Trump's agenda? Reince gave an answer, which was wholly unrelated to anything. Steve Bannon said 3 things. 1, we're going to reimagine the economy, right? 2, we're going to build the wall. Now, folks, particularly those of you of a certain age, know that when someone gives you a list of things, the number 1 and the number 2 thing they tell you are oftentimes not the most important thing they want you to know. They bury the lead. Number 3, we will deconstruct the administrative state. Big words. The press largely glossed over it and focused on building the wall, because that was coupled with a lot of the other crap that came out of Trump's mouth regarding, Mexicans are murderers and rapists, we were going to have this Muslim ban and all this other stuff. So they focused on that bright shining object, which Trump was very good at throwing up. But the most important through line from 2017 to yesterday was the deconstruction of the administrative state. What does that mean to you as a citizen of this country? It means that the institutions you value, the institutions that are there to protect your rights and to defend you at all costs, are broken down, where they have little value or use to your interest. They're repurposed for one purpose defined by something or someone else to fulfill an agenda. The manifesto of that arc from 2017 to this period is what? What was that?
2025.
Project 2025. The thing I've been trying to get people to understand for all these years, now I have a political history with Trump and I have a business history with Trump. So I know Trump before Trump was Trump. And they're the same man. The one thing about Donald Trump you have to understand and appreciate is he will always tell you what he's going to do. And you know why? Because he doesn't think you can stop him. He will bend the institution to his will. Oh, don't believe me? What about our judiciary? There's not a citizen in this room who had the legal quagmire that he is in would have a court bend over backwards and allow your behind to be on the streets as you threaten the daughter of a judge. It would not happen. I am the former lieutenant governor of my state. If I step outside the boundaries of the laws of the state of Maryland, I'm not going to get a pass in front of that judge when I go, well, I'm a former lieutenant governor. Don't I get like some special? No, baby, go to jail till you learn to shut your mouth. So that's the thread, the through line that everyone wants to ignore, and the press wants to, he doesn't mean it. Yes, he does. Stop it. You're buying the stupid pill. And you're willingly putting it into your mouth and swallowing it and dealing with the effects of it. Stop it. The truth is, the deconstruction of the administrative state has been day one plan, period. It now has a manual, 900 pages, called Project 2025. So I spent my summer wargaming Project 2025 over a 5-week period. Let me just say, what happens between December 6th and January 6th is nothing compared to what happens on January 21st, or quite actually by 5 p.m. on January 20th. Because the playbook requires, and Donald Trump even referenced this last night in his speech, that the moment 12:01 strikes, because that point he's president, the oath only takes a minute, his administration will begin the deportation efforts of U.S. citizens and those that they deem to be illegal. If there are any, remember in 2017, the weekend after the inauguration, 1 million women showed up in my hometown, Washington, D.C., where I grew up, to protest this administration. That ish will not be allowed next year. Don't even think about it. Because the moment you do, the invocation of the Insurrection Act will happen. He tried to do it 3 times. The last time was the Lafayette Park protests in Washington, D.C. And but for General Milley and other officials who will not be there deliberately this time, because Project 2025 requires that basically the top level of the government is removed and replaced by his loyalists. Loyalty to one person, not the Constitution, but to the man. Now, a lot of people think, oh, this is fanciful, it's not going to happen. It's happening. It's already happening. Right now, in the battleground states that both of these ladies have already talked about, are efforts at boards of elections and so forth designed to start that process from happening. Of the 7 battleground states, there are right now over 50 individuals who got elected to office, MAGA supporters who are in place to do one thing and one thing only. And what is that? To deconstruct the administrative state around our elections starting on Tuesday. So at some point, folks in this country have got to wake up to the fact that this is happening and it's real. And the roller coaster that's going to be between election night, where we won't necessarily know who the president is going to be, but what's going to happen is the early returns are going to come in. They're going to favor Trump. Why? Because that's the way it works. Because you can't count those early ballots until, like in a state like Pennsylvania, until 7 a.m. election day. And if you've got 700,000 ballots, for example, and there are way more than that, you're not going to get that counted in one day. You have a number of other states like Georgia that require that you cannot start that process until until the poll closes. So how do you think you're going to get a result? So you have these structures that have been reconformed in the case of Georgia that make it harder for people to vote, that make the institution harder to process that vote, and therefore to do what? Sow doubt about the result. And that will be the narrative over those days. The lawyers are in place. We reported on our air this past weekend that the RNC, instead of, which is something SE and I know very well back in the day, at this point, we're on the ground. We're figuring out, where's my vote? Okay, I got this community. I can make sure all y'all get out to vote. You got that group over there? No, I ain't doing that. They have 220,000 poll watchers prepared to go around to the 7 battleground states, and in particular, places where black and brown people live, to monitor their polls, because that's where the cheating is going to be. 220,000 people signed up to poll watch for MAGA and Trump this Tuesday. What do you think that means? What do you think that looks like when some jackbooted thug shows up all dressed in black in states where you are permitted to carry and shows up at a polling booth? What does that mean? What are you saying? What do you think happens? And I'm tired of Americans not thinking through what deconstruction of the administrative state really means, because you're about to live it. January 6th is not happening in Washington, D.C. It's going to happen in state capitals in the battleground states. That's the plan, to disrupt. You've already seen an early version of it, and when they tried to get rid of Gretchen Whitmer, they threatened the governor's life. They wanted to take over the state capitol, and they were told, not yet, stand down. So look, I'm looking at this from a lot of different perspectives. And the only thing I can tell folks at this point, which I've been saying for 4 weeks now, is overwhelm the ballot box with your vote. Because our system is designed, it is hard to cheat when you have to count 100,000, 200,000 more votes. SE's point, if it's just 11,780, that's all I need. It's much easier to get that number than 10 times that number.
We have a few minutes for questions. There are some microphones, and we will prioritize questions from our students.
That was a lecture.
I can't tell you what it's like to sit in a war game scenario where everybody's playing the entire government, right? You're playing roles. I actually got to play Trump on the last session, so I laid into the role. I know. Yes. I'm just gonna let people know. You made a point. I wanted to hear the point. No, just go ahead.
Do whatever you like.
Okay. This question. Well, thank you all for speaking today. Oh, sorry. Thank you all for speaking today. I just wanted to ask Lieutenant Governor a question. You spoke about your displeasure with the Washington Post for not endorsing Vice President Kamala,
Or anyone.
or anyone in general. Yes, of course.
Be clear.
But shouldn't that be a good thing? Because the whole point in, having these newspapers that we all read is that we are supposed to be, we think that we're reading unbiased news. So for organizations like the Post or the Times or whatever journalistic institution it may be, why should they endorse?
So let's separate. You said we should all be reading unbiased news. Absolutely. That's your front page. That's what a reporter goes out and asks questions, asks the who, what, where, when, and how of a situation, and reports back without opinion what happened, who did it, what happened, why it happened, where it happened, when it happened. And then you take that and you're like, oh, that was crazy, right? The editorial page is different. The The editorial page is a broader commentary on the who, what, where, when, how. And we have thoughts. That's why it's an editorial board. So it's more than one person. It's a collection of different points of view that come together. Now, as a candidate for office in a blue state, I already know they're not endorsing me, right? So endorsements never really played that much for me because of the politics. And I got it. I understood that. But at the end of the day, the reality of it is if you're going to do that, right? And you're going to do it in a way that you've done it before, then just be consistent. Don't tell me in 2016 that when you endorsed Hillary Clinton over Donald Trump, all right? And I give you a little bit of slack on that one because we didn't know all of Trump until later. But then there was 2020 when he ran against Joe Biden. And the paper made a conscious decision because it had now a track record that it itself had reported on and told us about. The who, what, where, when, and how of the last 4 years. Plus now the next 4 years of Biden's term and all the stuff that Trump was doing. And now, for some reason, in the face of a second impeachment, January 6th, 34 felonies, the list goes on, compared to the current vice president of the United States and all of that, you can't make a choice? You can't give us some thought about how you assess these candidates? I have a problem with that.
Can I also add, the editorial was written. Jeff Bezos stepped in and said no.
The next piece.
2 weeks before the election. It's not like they said 6 months ago, we're not going to endorse, we're going to do a new policy. It was the guy with the money pulled back and said, no, we're not going to do this because it's going to be bad for my pocketbook and my potential business. That's why. And the last thing I would say, too, with these things, it does hold candidates accountable to have to go to an editorial board and have a conversation and answer questions. And they're different questions than like the regular day-to-day journalist would ask. And so if you say, we're just not going to do it, then that's one other level of accountability that you've taken away, and that's a role that the media
and
really
again,
should be
it's
playing.
real quick. It's not that it's going to sway your vote one way or the other. I mean, you're intelligent, beings, and you figure out where you want to go and what you want to do. But they do serve as a guidepost for a society, for a community. That is an expression. That's why, paper A will endorse candidate B and paper B will endorse candidate A. And the citizenry is better for that in terms of the communication, because that endorsement is kind of like a sort of the exclamation point on a period of time in which you're now, and that's why when you read these editorials, they kind of lay out a little bit of that history, a little bit, to Karen's point, the questions that they ask. I have been in many of an editorial board meeting as a candidate and so forth, and it is very different and it's very grueling. It is very hard at times, but it's good, right? It's a stress test on the system. And when, of course, your masthead says, democracy dies in darkness, well, when you turn out the lights, baby,
That's the final thread here. I work at a newspaper. I've worked in newspapers for 20 years. If not for all of those reasons, that you wouldn't stand up for your own community and telegraph, we are making this endorsement, we are putting ourselves on the line because freedom of speech and freedom of the press is so important. We owe it to our readers to tell them who we think will best defend that, if not this policy or that policy. That's the very least you should be doing as a journalistic outfit. And to not do that when I put my ass on the line every night and go on TV, and we get pipe bombs sent to our office or death threats to my house, you're not going to go on record with all of your lawyers behind you and all of your money behind you and say who you would vote for? That's the cowardice that bothers, I think, a lot of us as well.
We're coming up on time. Can we maybe take 2 or 3 questions? We'll throw that out to our panelists before we have to wrap.
Hi, thank you. This is primarily for Ms. Cupp. We spoke a few minutes ago about the fact that the Republican Party has shifted from conservatism to populism. I think
that's nice. I think nationalism is what I would say.
Nationalism as well. It's a weird Trump brand of all of those things.
Yeah.
I am a Latino. I am a Democrat, or I'm voting for Democrats, and I always have. I think that I'm curious to see what everybody's thoughts are on the fact that the Democratic Party is losing a lot of key constituencies. They're losing a lot of traction with Latino voters, with African American voters, men especially, and then with also white men. Is it that the Democratic Party has conceded to too many progressive ideals and is putting itself in a dangerous position? Does the Democratic Party need to rethink its strategy in recent years and go back to a more moderate view of liberalism? Because in my view, Trump shouldn't be winning in these constituencies. I don't see my demographic choosing Trump over something slightly more moderate.
Can I just make one quick point on that, on the numbers? We have to remember this has been a 107-day campaign. This is a woman who moved 15 points in 30 days. No politician has ever done that. And she's closed the gap with black men as of last weekend. So I want us to remember that a Republican presidential candidate is always going to get, in terms of black voters, 11%, 12%, 6%. I mean, the percentages have been going up. And Trump, I think, if they would have done the autopsy, we would be in a lot more of a competitive posture. And I just want us to remember, Trump is trying to get 1%, half of 1%. That's nothing. We're trying to actually, this again is where the asymmetry comes in. You know, when you're getting 90% of the black vote or 80% of the Latino vote, we're talking about very small percentages. So I just think we have to be careful when we say, like, we're losing this or that, because we're talking about small numbers and percentages in the bigger picture. And again, we're seeing those gaps close as we get closer. But the last thing I'll say is, look, I think both parties should do a lot more work to treat everybody like a swing voter, and do more to go to people where they are and talk to people about what they care about, and not just focus on the 7 states.
I'm really glad you asked that. Because, as was mentioned, we were supposed to have Scott Jennings here representing a full-throated, modern, today Republican, right? And it's an important voice. That's an important voice to hear from, too. So let me just say, yes, if I were Democrats, I'd be very worried about some of the voters that Trump is getting. Very worried, because you are right. He should not be successfully messaging to some of these constituencies in whatever numbers. Karen's right, and Karen also, is coming from a place, I understand, but it is mind-boggling, right, to think about someone who repeatedly denigrates minorities making inroads with minorities, right? It is mind-blowing. The way he talks about women, the things he has been convicted of doing to women, the things he has admitted doing to women, winning women, okay? I'd be very concerned. And there are lots of reasons why that is, but I think the biggest reason, if I could pinpoint it, is for a number of years, Democrats have told you, do not believe what you are feeling. Crime is not a problem. It's a Republican invention, in fact. The economy is great, the strongest it's ever been. Lagging indicators, mumbo jumbo stuff that you don't feel when you're going home and rationing your money for gas and groceries. Democrats are really good at telling you your feelings are wrong. And that is politics 101. Do not do that. Do not do that. Now, on the other hand, to be fair, Republicans are also telling you things are much worse than they are. Okay? But fear will win that argument every time. And so when I talk to Hispanic men in Reading, Pennsylvania, and it's a sizable group, and they are voting for Trump, they say he's talking about my problems in a way that I think historically Democrats have not. Whether it's immigration or crime or the economy, AKA the top 3 issues in this election, right? And that's why you've seen some Democratic mayors in some big cities lose their jobs. Some AGs in big cities lose their jobs because the electorate is not dumb. They might not have the charts or the numbers or the stats, but feelings don't care about your statistics. Statistics don't care about your feelings. This is the trouble, I think. Democrats are really good at standing up for the little guy. They do that better than Republicans, for sure. But when they're telling the little guy you're wrong about how you feel, that's why he's getting them. And it's a problem. It's a problem, and I want an autopsy. I want this sort of reckoning too, because we want 2 strong parties. And believe me, I shit on my party all the time. My record is clean, okay, in terms of what I've said. But just to have some honesty and someone who will say, to your point, Democrats are messing up too. I think is important to hear.
Can I put a real bit quick coda from an experience I had on this, and I think it gets to the heart of what both Karen and Essie said. So in the 2016 cycle, right before the general election, I was witnessed a focus group. And in the focus group, it was a diverse group of folks, and there was this white female mother of 2 divorced from New Hampshire who was all into Trump. And they asked her, "Why are you supporting Trump?" And you know what her answer was? Because he's just like me. And the problem that the media and both the Democratic and Republican parties have had since then is they haven't figured out why she answered that question that way.
Yeah. Why do you think he's like you?
They have not figured out why a white suburban female would say that, which would then lead to Hillary Clinton losing 52% of white suburban females in that election. But it gets better than that. Biden would lose a big portion of them in 2020 as well. And the reality of it is, at the heart of all of this with MAGA and Trump, there is a larger segment of our population, and I've been saying this since the very beginning, that is not just Republicans. It's not just Republicans. There aren't that many Republicans in the country to make up the numbers. And the reality of it is, we have to culturally, politically, socially, and economically look at each other and understand what each other is saying about their situation. We have to understand why, I would say, someone, a party, a person, is more like me than you are. And in politics, that's a core thing for us to do, which we just haven't done.
But I
Quick last word, Karen.
Yeah, I just want to name something, having worked on 2016. We did get it. Here's what it was. The number one reason people who would vote, what we found in post-election polling, that people said they were going to vote for Trump, it had to do with cultural anxiety. It had to do with feeling, a lot of white voters feeling squeezed, feeling uncertain in their place in this country, in the changes in this country. So to me, it was, we said $15 minimum wage, and he said, it's their fault. It's not your fault, it's their fault. And we didn't listen to what people were trying to tell us about how they were feeling, to what Essie is saying. Not all Democrats are as bad as Essie was describing them. A lot of people do a lot of really good work of trying to understand what their electorate is feeling. But I do think a huge challenge, and it's interesting that we have a Black South Asian woman who is trying to say, just take me for who I am. I'm not running as a woman. I'm not running as a person of color. I acknowledge that these things are important, but she's trying to just be herself. That's also part of her can't you just judge me by the work? That's kind of her ethos. At a moment when I think one of the underpinnings of what's happening in this election that we won't have time to talk about, obviously, is the cultural shift that's happening in this country as we become a majority and minority country. And I also think in the aftermath of the Me Too movement, where men who are not part of Me Too have been feeling also squeezed. Like, well, wait a second, I'm not that guy. And we didn't really have a conversation with men about that as that movement was unfolding. So I think you always have to recognize there are cultural currents that impact our politics and how you might say, well, this guy gets me and this person doesn't. And there are moments where I think part of what's going on now, there are people who might say, I think this guy gets me, but he makes me nervous. I'm scared. He's making me nervous, which is what I heard.
They're not saying Trump makes them nervous.
Actually, that is what they're saying, because I was canvassing. Let me finish.
Young men?
Let me finish. No, I wasn't talking about young men.
I'm talking about this young man.
I know, but I was saying what I was saying. You
I
get
thought
to
you
say
were
what you want to say.
No,
I
no,
get
no,
to say what I want to say.
No, I'm not trying to make you defensive.
No.
I thought you were referring to young men.
Don't worry,
That's why.
mom and dad aren't getting divorced.
we're
They're
not,
just
we're not.
having an
Actually, we
argument.
are.
It's
We do
fine.
this all the time.
It's
Trust
fine.
me.
I know mom and dad.
So I was in a suburb of Pennsylvania, white working class woman, voted for Trump, and said to me, my husband and I were really nervous that he keeps talking about revenge. He's not talking about us anymore. That's what I'm saying.
Oh, okay.
I'm saying that there are voters who are saying, I mean, I think he gets me a little more than she gets me, but he's scaring me right now. And she and her husband.
Yeah.
So I think that's the other dynamic, but that doesn't change the fact what I was trying to get back to is there's still those cultural currents going on. We're just not necessarily, I think for a lot of people, we have a bigger threat that people are feeling that at some point as a country we still have to deal with.
Obviously, this discussion is just getting going. And unfortunately, I have
Just
to
warming
wrap
up.
it all up. A couple of our guests have other engagements this evening. So please join me in a round of applause for our
Thank you,
guests.
everybody.
Thank you.
Maybe we can get them to join us after the election, and we can continue this conversation. Thank you.